Hi, it's Thursday, April 9th, 2026, and this is Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. I want to thank my colleague Tim Clauser, who filled in for me the last few days so I could take some days off to rest and recharge. And it's a good thing to be back in action today because another lawsuit has been filed against Washington state's new income tax. Now, we knew this one was coming from Citizen Action Defense Fund and Executive Director Jackson Maynard. And along with him is former State Attorney General Rob McKenna, who filed this suit in Klickitat County Superior Court. That was one of the things we're waiting to find out is where that suit was going to be filed. So it's Klickitat County Superior Court, which is way over in the southeast corner of the state in Goldendale. That's where a couple of the plaintiffs involved in the lawsuit reside. So that's where they filed today. I had a chance after this morning's press conference to meet with one of the other prominent players in this lawsuit, who is former state senator and former Washington State Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge. He is representing one of the lead plaintiffs in the case, so he is a party to this. And I was thrilled to get a chance to kind of sit down with him after the morning press conference announcing the suit to get a little bit more of his insights into, why join this and why he thinks this is such an important fight. And then, in keeping with our lawsuits theme for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily, there is another challenge that has been filed to the new sheriff decertification law. This is Senate Bill 5974. This one is coming from the Washington State Sheriff's Association and Kitsap County Sheriff candidate Rick Kuss, who has been out campaigning for months already. He ran before back in 2022 and had a very impressive showing, but fell just short. May not even be allowed to run, though, because of this this legislation recently signed into law by Governor Ferguson. He's got a decorated Navy career and he's got current law enforcement experience with the King County Sheriff's Department, but it's not enough based on this new law. And of course, he's quite displeased about that. So let's jump into today's episode. Citizen Action Defense Fund and Executive Director Jackson Maynard today filed a legal challenge to the income tax. And again, it was in Klickitat County Superior Court where this has been filed. That's in Southeast Washington in Goldendale. And two of the plaintiffs in the case reside there in Klickitat County. And the challengers can potentially find a more favorable court outcome than on this side of the mountains. That may have played into some of the decision on which court venue to file in. I know that was one of the considerations, so we're going to break that down for you now. So at the core of the lawsuit filed today is whether income is considered property, which some Democrats argue it is not. Rob McKenna, former state attorney general, says the Constitution is clear here in the state of Washington, and that people have a property right to their income. So my income, my bank account, just like my home, my car in the driveway, is my property. It is mine. And the Washington Constitution says we could institute an income tax, but it would have to be uniform and it would have to be by our current state constitution limited to 1%. Unless you amend, again, the state constitution to make it differently. So that's what's different this time around is there's no attempt by those who've backed Senate Bill 6346 for the income tax, the tax on millionaires. There is no attempt to amend the state constitution to do it. It's just basically pass it. Might be unconstitutional, but it's going to be the courts that ultimately decide. And that's kind of been the route. So Governor Bob Ferguson has said he believes that the court is going to rule in their favor and that this is the time to push this. Given the current makeup of the court, that might be the case. But remember, we have 5 positions on the current state Supreme Court that could be changing sides. Maybe you're going to have a more conservative court or at least a couple of more members of the court by the time this legal challenge reaches the state Supreme Court. So that is certainly something to consider in all of this. Now, we, on the last couple of days of session, had an opportunity to be in the governor's conference room as he signed this bill, 6346, for the income tax and some of the other last minute bills to be signed into law. And one of the reporters who gathered with him after kind of pressed him on this and said, what do you think about all the legal challenges coming to the income tax?
They'll have their day in court. And that's as it should be. They'll have their day before the people. Totally appropriate. I'm very supportive of the initiative process, and I think the people should weigh in on this. The Supreme Court should weigh in on this. So I've got zero issue on that, and I feel confident going forward.
Now, in this morning's press conference, where reporters, we were given an opportunity to ask some questions, I had a chance to ask former Attorney General Rob McKenna about Governor Ferguson's recent comments, because Governor Ferguson told a local television station that I've been on the opposite side with McKenna many times when I was AG and never lost a case when McKenna was litigating the other side. So I asked Rob McKenna about that somewhat personal uh, attack, I guess, if you will, from Governor Ferguson in this morning's press conference. And this is what he said.
I think it's very telling that Bob wants to personalize this and doesn't want to address the legal issues involved here. He was Attorney General. He's a lawyer. He understands what it means to have plain language in the Constitution and to have a series of Supreme Court decisions. This is not a boxing match. This is an important question of law, but he doesn't want to talk about the law. Instead, he signed into law a bill that clearly violates the law today, which is why he and the legislators who voted for it need the Supreme Court to change the law for them. And as of the day they voted for it, it was illegal. It violated the Constitution. And unlike former governors like Dan Evans, who had the courage and political skill to put together a coalition to put this to the voters as a constitutional amendment, Governor Ferguson was unable to do that. And the legislature was unable to come up with the votes to send a constitutional amendment to the voters either. Instead, Governor Ferguson and the legislature are working hard to keep this issue away from the voters. And all voters ought to be very concerned about that.
Now, former Democrat state senator and former state Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge has joined the fight alongside former AG McKenna and Citizen Action Defense Fund. Now, specifically, Talmadge is representing his client in this, one of the plaintiffs, which is the Ethnic Chamber of Commerce, and a number of small business operators that fall under that umbrella, who are very concerned that they're going to be hit hard by this income tax. And so I spoke with Talmadge after today's press conference.
The communities we're talking about are people that are largely small businesses that are aspirational. They want to grow. They want to expand their businesses, and they want to generate significant income. So they do that. And what's the response from the state? Well, we're going to not only tax you in your business capacity, but we're going to tax you on your income. And they're concerned about that. I mean, it's a problem for them, and it's something that is a deterrent for them to do greater achievement than they've already done and have proven over the years. Hispanic folks and people from the Asian Pacific community both have been remarkable in their efforts to take a piece of the American dream and run with it.
Now, Democrats, of course, say that this tax is needed to address what they call a regressive tax system in the state of Washington, where they contend that the richest are not paying their fair share. Critics say not only is it against the state constitution, but that it will open the door to a tax on the income of all Washingtonians. And now remember, we also have Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Haywood asking the state Supreme Court to let them run a referendum campaign. We talked about this last week. Secretary of State Steve Hobbs refused to process Haywood's referendum request, telling the Center Square that, since the bill was written to be sort of referendum proof, it's deemed necessary for the budget, you can't let voters weigh in. So he just kind of summarily dismissed it. The Secretary of State did. So Haywood has gone back to the state Supreme Court and said, wait a minute, he was completely out of line here in dismissing an opportunity for the voters to weigh in. And Haywood's sense is that the interpretation of the Secretary of State on what our Constitution says to make something referendum proof is wrong. It should be an emergency and necessary to implement the budget, not one or the other. And that's the contention of Haywood in his challenge to the state Supreme Court. And then, of course, also coming from Let's Go Washington, likely a couple of initiative campaigns, likely one that goes directly to the legislature and one that goes directly to the people, bypassing the legislature. Those initiatives require far more signatures than a referendum would. A referendum would only require a couple 100,000 signatures. You might need twice that or close to twice that, assuming you've got, some invalidation rate for folks that sign to get an initiative qualified to the ballot. But both of those paths are likely this year. So things are moving still rapidly. Multiple lawsuits, a challenge request to the secretary or to the state Supreme Court from the Secretary of State's refusal to process the referendum, and then the initiatives to come. So much to follow on this, and it is changing literally several times a day. Now, to the latest lawsuit over the sheriff decertification law, set to take effect at the end of this month, actually in less than 3 weeks, April 30th, unless a court grants an injunction. And we now have a second lawsuit. Now, this is the law, remind you that Senate Bill 5974 is the law that allows the Criminal Justice Training Commission to decertify a sitting sheriff. And it also sets new requirements for sheriff candidates, saying among those, you've got to be at least 25 years old. You have to have a good standing on social media. There's a little bit of room for interpretation there. You have to have 5 years of consecutive law enforcement experience. So, as we reported earlier this week, Eastern Washington has 4 sheriffs that have filed their own lawsuit, and they're doing this with the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, WASPIC. That lawsuit has been filed, and that's in Ponderay County. So that is, I'm going to read here so I don't get this wrong. It's Spokane County Sheriff John Knowles. Am I pronouncing it right? It's either Knowles or Nowles. I should have found that out. Pardon me if I forgot that or got that wrong. Ponderay County Sheriff Glenn Blanksley, Stevens County Sheriff Brad Mackey, and Ferry County Sheriff Ray Maycumber. Again, the 4 of them have filed this suit, arguing the law is unconstitutional. And now we have Kitsap County Sheriff's candidate Rick Kuss, who, along with the Washington State Sheriff's Association, or WASA, have filed this lawsuit in Thurston County Superior Court. That was filed on Monday, on April the 6th, arguing that sections of the new law are unconstitutional. And they, as well as the other 4 sheriffs, are seeking an injunction, basically to tell a court, block implementation of this. We don't want this going into effect even while these court cases play out. So we'll see if either of those challenges are successful in getting an injunction. Now, Kuss has 24 years of decorated service in the U.S. Navy, and he's a current King County Sheriff's deputy. But this new law disqualifies him from running for sheriff. Their suit names defendants Gerald Wills, who is the interim executive director of the Washington Criminal Justice Training Commission, and Washington State Patrol Chief John Batiste. I should tell you, I reached out to both. I did receive a response via email to both, basically saying since there's litigation pending, we can't really comment at this point. But here is part of my conversation with Kitsap County Sheriff's candidate Rick Kuss. Had this conversation with him late on Wednesday.
I knew there was going to be legal challenges from everywhere across the state, and I definitely wanted to be a part of that because it's definitely a fight worth fighting. And so It's kind of difficult to get everybody kind of combined on one lawsuit. We saw earlier last week the four sheriffs that filed with their prosecuting attorneys. Um, and so I reached out to Joe Ard. He's known for, fighting these unconstitutional things in the state. He also lives in Kitsap. And so he was working with the Washington State Sheriff's Association to also file a lawsuit. And so I told him that I wanted to be a part of it. And so he consulted the Sheriff's Association and they all agreed. They represent 39 sheriffs. And so they agreed that they would back the lawsuit that I'm in. So myself and the Washington State Sheriff's Association are co-plaintiffs in this lawsuit. And so the big thing with this lawsuit, not only does it challenge like my qualifications and the law that prevents someone from running, it also challenges the vacancy process that's created and how the CJTC is in a role. So the lawsuit shows the defendants as Washington State, the Washington State Patrol, and the Criminal Justice Training Commission. And the state legislator in the state constitution has the authority to make qualifications. However, they do not have the authority to delegate it to the executive branch, so i.e. the CJTC or the WSP. So why some of these things the state legislator can do, what they can't do is have WSP, you do the investigation with the CJTC and determine who is qualified. That is unconstitutional, and so we are fighting that as well as removing a sheriff and creating that vacancy. So this bill is just bad all around. We could probably just fill it up with thousands of pages of a lawsuit, but kind of attacking the big thing, protecting the people that want to run for sheriff and the ones that are in sheriff, protecting the voters' rights on who they voted for.
Now, the other issue with this new law is how much power and discretion that it really gives to the Criminal Justice Training Commission. And the concern here raised by opponents, including those in these lawsuits, is that it could be potentially weaponized to remove an elected sheriff if CJTC maybe doesn't like the sheriff's politics. Um, Many suggested the bill was squarely aimed at Pierce County's Sheriff Keith Swank, who basically said, go ahead and try it. See what happens. Just try to remove me, the elected sheriff, from office and see how my constituents respond. So he was intentionally inflammatory in those comments to get some attention to this because, he has concerns that because he's been very active politically, speaking out against some of the bills that were directed at, forcing immigration and customs officers to, demask basically. He spoke out, in pretty stiff opposition to that. So he's worried that this bill was kind of aimed at him. And others thought, yeah, maybe it was. Um, that could be the concern here. And Cuss is very concerned that some of his social media posts that he's made in recent years could come back and burn him as well.
Upon determining who's qualified to run for sheriff or hold office, there is a social media accounts review. There is the background investigation and the poly. And so, like I mentioned before, the legislature can determine qualifications, but you can't say WSP is this person qualified or not based on your background investigation, based on the poly, which is inadmissible to begin with. Um, but especially social media. So there's candidates that kind of just, and sheriffs that kind of stay off, and there's some that are vocal about what's going on and what's wrong. And for some group like the Criminal Justice Training Commission to be able to remove or say someone's not qualified to run for sheriff based on their content on their social media is insane. And so I consider myself probably more vocal on social media because there's a lot of things that are bad, a lot of things that are wrong, a lot of crime, and I'm very outspoken about it. And that should not be politically motivated for a group to decertify or remove someone or not let them run.
Now, in the other lawsuit from the four sheriffs filed in Pend Oreille County, there is already a hearing set for April the 16th. So 1 week from today to consider the plaintiff's motion for declaratory judgment and that preliminary injunction, basically to stop the April 30th implementation of this law and allow guys like Rick Cuss to continue on with their campaign. So that would kind of put things on hold and postpone the law from being implemented. Um, Cuss told me in his case, he's also hoping for an expedited review of their case because remember, he's running for election this year. He's already got a whole bunch of donors, volunteers, folks that have been, heavily invested in his campaign going back to last November when he made the decision to run again, well before this law was even introduced early in the legislative session. And so he says there are real harms to these people that back his campaign. So he is also hoping for that injunction to allow his campaign to continue, even as, both of these lawsuits move forward in the courts. Could be a little bit of a slower process. And remember the argument from opponents during session for this bill, both from lawmakers, including every Republican, not a single Republican backed this bill, and from those testifying against it. They said it was really the most glaring example of government overreach that we've seen in the Washington state legislature in recent years because law enforcement leaders are already held accountable. They're the only elected officials in the state who would be subjected to this kind of treatment. And remember, sheriffs are directly elected in 38 of Washington's 39 counties, directly elected by the people. So if the people decide to put a sheriff in office and that sheriff posts something that the Criminal Justice Training Commission doesn't like, they could move to decertify him. And so there's, a lot of reason for concern if we want to go down this route. Make sure this is even constitutional. Both of these lawsuits now suggest it is not. So that is it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Check out the the Center Square Washington's page for more stories like this. And I appreciate you watching. Always join us again for tomorrow's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Have a great day.